Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today we are going to be going through the top 50 most shelved science fiction books on Goodreads. And for each of them, I'm going to let you know if I've read it, and if so, how much I enjoyed it, and if not, how high it is on my TBR. And we'll keep track and see what our score is at the end of the video. So, as we kick things off with number one, what else was it going to be? Dune by Frank Herbert. And while it isn't my own number one, I do really like it. I do rank it highly, and you guys, how good was Dune Part 2? That movie was so good, it made me excited to continue the series. Dune Messiah is actually going to be the next book that I read. All right, moving on to number two, Ender's Game. I have read it, and some of my friends read this book recently, and they didn't like it that much, but it's in my top 10. It's in my top 10 sci-fi books. I really like the characters. I really like the ending. I think it's good for both new readers to sci-fi and experienced readers. I think everyone should give it a try. All right, number three, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I have read this. Although it was on my list of shame for a while, I read it for the first time last year, and it's really funny. I really enjoyed it. I've heard some comparisons to Kurt Vonnegut, and I see a little bit of an overlap. I think some of my subscribers just know how big a fan I am of Vonnegut, and they use that to get me to finally try Douglas Adams. At number four, we have The Martian. I have read this as well, and this is another one that I think that is great for both new readers to sci-fi and experienced readers. There's a little bit of hard sci-fi, but it's fun, it's fast-paced, it moves quickly, and I liked the movie, but I wasn't quite as high on it as some people, but I think they did a pretty good job. I think that's worth watching as well. All right, as we move on to our next batch, Ready Player One. I have read this, and I liked it. It was fun. I know it does lean into the nostalgia, lean into the references, but it's an adventure. If you like something that kind of feels a little bit like a video game, I think you're going to have a fun time with it. And I think it's good for maybe younger sci-fi readers as well. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I have read this, and Ray Bradbury, probably one of the best writers in science fiction in terms of his prose. There's some interesting ideas, and there's a reason why this has remained to be considered as one of the dystopian classics. Right next to another one of the dystopian classics, 1984 by George Orwell. Of those dystopian classics, 1984 is my personal favorite. I think they're all great, but just for the story, the characters, the emotional impact, the weight that I carried around for, I don't know, the next decade after I finished having read this book, I think this definitely needs to belong on any sci-fi reader's shelf. Okay, we come up to the first one that I haven't read, and that is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Although I have watched the movies, and I remember I quite enjoyed them. I think probably I like the first two the most, but I had a good time. This one, I would say, is not super high on my TBR, but I probably do want to try it at some point, just because I do like the premise. It was so popular and kind of influential. A lot of things since have kind of borrowed little things from Hunger Games, so maybe I should read The Hunger Games. All right, let's see. What do we have with our next batch? We've got, keeping up a little bit of a theme with our dystopian books, we've got Brave New World, although it seems like a little bit of a utopia, or is it in fact a dystopia? I really enjoyed this one as well, especially for the ideas, but I maybe didn't quite enjoy the story quite as much as I did 1984, but that's another one that I highly recommend. Foundation. Now, Foundation by Isaac Asimov, that is a pillar of science fiction book history. So many things have drawn from Foundation in terms of the ideas, the world building. The characters are a little bit dry. The plot is not always the main focus, but I think it's really clever. A lot of great ideas in there, very influential on the science fiction genre. All right, up next we have Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick, one of my favorite writers. Do Androids Dream? Not my favorite Philip PKD book, but it is definitely worth a read. And I think you should check out both Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. I'm Team 2049. Let me know which side of the Blade Runner film Civil War. Is there a Civil War? Yeah. Well, let's call it a Civil War. A Blade Runner Civil War team you are on. And then, of course, we have a sequel to The Hunger Games, which, of course, I have not read. So far we're doing pretty well. Oh, look at this. More Hunger Games. I need to read these Hunger Games. Look how high they are on this list. Okay, so The Three Body Problem. I have read The Three Body Problem. You can actually see it on my shelf. There you go. That's the series, the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. I'm a big fan. I like books 2 and 3 more, but you got to read book 1 to get to books 2 and 3. And I still like book 1. Yes, it has flat characters. The story, I know the story's pretty good, but the story gets even better in books 2 and 3. But it's the ideas. If you like hard sci-fi, if you like mind-melting, brain-breaking type reads, and there are a few things that have broken my brain more than reading the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. All right, next we moved on to Project Hail Mary, which I have read by Andy Weir, and do I like it more than The Martian? Yes, but only slightly, because they're both awesome. They're both 5-star reads for me. I would say that I slightly preferred the setting in The Martian, but I slightly preferred the characters and the scope of the story and ideas in Project Hail Mary, but they're both awesome. I'm a sci-fi reader. I like it. Some of my fantasy friends, they like it. My dad, who usually more reads mystery and action type stuff, he liked it too. Project Hail Mary, it's for everybody. And then we have The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. So I have read this one. I read it quite a while ago, and I thought it was a pretty good read. I think that a modern audience might not find it that mind-blowing when we've been exposed to so many time travel stories. But being one of the first time travel stories, I believe the first time travel novel, full novel about time travel, using a machine in order to do so, I think it would have probably blown some minds in 1895. And I think it's still a good read, and it's good to kind of see the history of the subgenre, but it's not going to be one of my all-time favorites. All right, as we move on to some cyberpunk, arguably the cyberpunk novel, we have Neuromancer by William Gibson. And I have read this, and I go back and forth on my experience with Neuromancer, because at the time, I struggled to connect to it. I got a little bit confused at times. But after I finished it, I did some more reading, I did some more research, I kind of dived into it a bit more. Some of the pieces started to fall into place, and I think I enjoyed it a little bit more on retrospect, or at least appreciated it. So this is a book that I respect for what it did for the genre of cyberpunk, even if it might not be a top 10 personal favorite for me. Okay, moving on to All Systems Red, the first book in the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. Everyone told me this book was funny. It's more sad than funny to me. I don't know. Murderbot, I kind of just wanted to give Murderbot a hug. I wasn't laughing. I was feeling empathy for Murderbot. So different people might have different experiences with this. I did like some of the ideas, but I'm not sure. I'm not going to be continuing the series right away, but maybe I'll pick it back up in the future, because I did like some aspects of it. Okay, next up we have Leviathan Wakes, the first book in the Expanse series. I have read that, and it's one of my favorites. I've read all 9 of the Expanse novels, and Leviathan Wakes gets off to a good start. It's one of the best ones. We follow 2 different storylines. They're both action-packed. They're both intriguing. They weave together. I think it's a solid. If you like things that are character-based, have a fast-moving plot, try out the Expanse. And then we have I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. So Asimov appearing again. I have read this one, and I really liked the ideas of the individual stories, but it definitely feels like a short story collection that was kind of stitched up rather than a novel made up of these different robot stories. So I liked some of them more than others, but I think all of them had at least sort of one interesting central idea that the story revolved around, and that's Asimov's strength. So if you like that style of classic sci-fi writing, definitely check out iRobot. As we keep going, we get up to Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. So I have read this as well. We're on a pretty good streak of having read the books on this list, and I liked it. But I actually like the movie more. It's not often that I end up enjoying the film more than the book, but everyone told me the kids were annoying, and I was like, they're kids. How annoying can they be? Answer, really, really annoying. You want the dinosaurs to eat them. But I still had a good time with this, and I need to read more from Michael Crichton. All right, with another modern entry, we have Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. I love this. The TV show on Apple TV's just come out. I need to watch. I'm hyped. I'm hyped, you guys, because this is one of my favorites. I'm really high on Dark Matter. I think in terms of the plot, the pacing, the action, the ideas, Crouch just throws them all into a blender and just lets it rip. Yeah, this book is at an 11 from page 1 till you close the book. And I love it. Sometimes you're in the mood for that. I was when I read it, and I think Dark Matter knocked it out of the park. All right. Complete opposite end of the spectrum, The Left Hand of Darkness. It's very slow. It's very thinky. It is thought-provoking. There's characters, there's society, there's aliens, there's culture. And I didn't love The Left Hand of Darkness as much as some people. I struggled to connect to it a little bit, but I do understand why it was very influential. It would have been revolutionary at the time, and I do plan on reading more Ursula K. Le Guin because I think she's a good writer. And then Hyperion. Hyperion is one of my favorites. If you subscribe to the channel, I've probably talked about Hyperion before, just a little bit perhaps. I'm very high on Hyperion, and I'm higher on the sequels than other people. I think it does a great job of blending space opera with other subgenres of science fiction, like cyberpunk, noir, a little bit of horror, a little bit of fantasy. Hyperion, it gives you everything. Let's see, what could possibly follow Hyperion? Another one of my favorite writers, Arthur C. Clarke, with 2001, A Space Odyssey. I love this book. I think it's a 5-star book, and yet it's not my favorite Clarke book. I like Childhood's End even more. But 2001, A Space Odyssey is great. I like the movie too, and I think they're a good team because Clarke and Kubrick worked on the story together, and so I think you get a little bit of elements of both. A little bit of more of Kubrick comes out in the film, a little bit more of Clarke comes out in the book, and so it doesn't give you all the answers, but I think they complement each other well. All right, we now have another H.G. Wells book, which I haven't read, which is The War of the Worlds. This has been on my TBR for a while. I have watched at least one of the film adaptations. I don't know how many there has been. And I think I need to read more from H.G. Wells. I've been thinking recently that I need to read more sci-fi from the 1800s. And Wells is definitely one of the authors that I need to read more from. Then we have Red Rising by Pierce Brown. So speaking of books that may have been influenced by the Hunger Games, Red Rising. First book, yes, it does feel a little bit Hunger Games-esque, but then after that, the series kind of grows into like a bigger, grander space opera. I've read the first 3, and Golden Sun was my favorite. That's book number 2, but book number 1, Red Rising, yeah, it was still pretty good. Read it if you're looking for some character-based stories with some good action. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, Dune Messiah. I don't get a point, seeing as I haven't read it yet, but in 2 days from now, I'll be picking it up. So I'm looking forward to seeing what direction the story goes after Dune. All right, it looks like we have Divergent up next, which I believe is YA. I haven't read this one yet, although I have seen... Have I seen the movies? I feel like I watched a film on a plane, and I always forget whether it was Divergent or Maze Runner because I was halfway over the Pacific Ocean between Los Angeles and Sydney. So forgive me for forgetting whether I watched Divergent or Maze Runner, but I haven't read the book. All right, up next, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I have read Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, but I haven't read The Handmaid's Tale, which I definitely need to do because that is a classic. It has the TV show as well, which I haven't seen. So of the ones that I haven't read, this one's fairly high up on the TBR, I would say. Followed by Stranger in a Strange Land, another classic novel that I haven't read, which probably should be on the TBR. This one seems to be very polarizing. Some people love Stranger in a Strange Land. Some people say it's too strange. It gets pretty weird, especially in the back half. And then moving on to The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Book 2 in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I have read this as well. I did continue with the series after reading Hitchhiker's Guide, and I like this one, but not quite as much. I started to find this one a little less funny and a little more depressing. So it'll be interesting to see where the series goes. I've heard it continues to trend in that direction, but hey, if I'm in the mood for something that makes me want to question my existence and the purpose of the universe, I'll pick up some more Hitchhikers. Okay, with our next book, we have The Martian Chronicles, another book by Ray Bradbury, which I have read. I read relatively recently, and it is a stitch-up novel. It is a series of short stories, all revolving around things that are happening on Mars, a trip to Mars, and the future of humans. And I did like a lot of the ideas. Bradbury's prose is, of course, amazing as always. I slightly prefer Fahrenheit 451, but I think The Martian Chronicles is a great Bradbury work as well. And then Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This was on my list of shame for a while as well, but I'm glad I finally read it because this is a top 10 book for me. I think it might be cropped out on the stream. But over here, if you can just imagine where my finger is pointing, I do have the Folio Society edition, which is a lovely gift from my wife for Christmas because I'm such a big fan of Frankenstein. Up next, we have Cinder by Marissa Meyer. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with this book. I think this might be a YA book. If anybody's read it, you can let me know in the comments what this book is about. I'm going to say this is probably not as high on my TBR, but maybe I'll read it one day. And then Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut, I love all of his books. I've read all of his novels. I recently did a tier ranking of all 14 of his novels. He also has short stories and essays as well, and I won't spoil the video, but Slaughterhouse 5 ranks pretty high. If you like books that are existential, they deal with time travel, aliens, war, heavy themes, but is also kind of darkly funny at the same time, Slaughterhouse 5. Give it a read. And it's short, too. It's not a 1,000-page chunker. It's like 200 pages or less. Okay, now we have some cyberpunk, some 90s cyberpunk, clearly influenced by Neuromancer. And I would say this is probably an influence on Ready Player One. So you can see a little bit of a lineage there. I enjoyed this one. It was fun. It was cool. It was a little bit corny, but had some really cool ideas. Neil Stephenson, very clever guy. He describes these VR goggles, which sound exactly like how VR goggles work in terms of like the specific specs. And he wrote this book in 1992. Like, can this guy time travel or something? I was very impressed. And following Snow Crash, we have The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, the first book in the Wayfarers series. I haven't read this, but I do own it. So I will say this is pretty high on my TBR. I'm going to be reading that one later this year. And then Old Man's War by John Scalzi. I have read this one as well. And it's fun. It's kind of like the Forever War. Imagine like a bit of a modern take on Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, but with a little bit more humor, a bit of a sarcastic sense of humor. These elder citizens get recruited to fight in a war against aliens, given new bodies, and they kind of have fun with their new bodies. They look still grumpy though. They're still a little curmudgeonly. And The Giver. I read this one by Lois Lowry a long time ago. I remember I liked it, but I guess it didn't leave the biggest impression on me because I couldn't tell you that much about it. I haven't included it in any of my all-time favorite lists, but I remember when I read it that I thought it was worth reading. Okay, moving on. We have Speaker for the Dead, the second book in Ender's Saga after Ender's Game. I like this one, but it was not what I expected after Ender's Game. It's a lot slower, it's more philosophical. It kind of deals with some fairly heavy themes, and I think it pays off. I did really like the ending to the book, but I think a large portion of the book I spent comparing it to what I liked about Ender's Game, and I wasn't really getting that from the book. So I think I might enjoy this more on a reread, sort of knowing a bit more what to expect, and I can just sort of dive into those themes without expecting some of the same plot and character elements from Ender's Game. Following up Speaking for the Dead, a sequel with another sequel, this time the Foundation sequel, Foundation and Empire. Asimov, getting a few books on this list. I like this one less than Foundation, although I do think it has the best character in the Foundation series. So I thought it was a little bit, the pacing was a little bit slow. I didn't think the ideas were as good, but if you're a character reader, you might enjoy this one more than the first book in Foundation. Up next, we have A Wrinkle in Time, which I haven't read. I know this is a lot of people's sort of childhood favorites, and a lot of people I know that have reread it as an adult and still enjoyed it. So I'm not sure how sci-fi this is. Well, Wrinkle in Time, I'm sure there's some timey-wimey stuff in there. So let's say, yeah, I'm sure it counts as sci-fi. And then we have Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which I own a copy of, but I haven't read yet. So it is fairly high on my TBR, seeing as I own that. And I have watched the movie, which I thought had some really cool aspects. Got pretty weird at times. Let's get weird, you guys. Okay, I think we only have a few more to go. The list isn't numbered. Let's just say we're around 43. Yeah, that'll do. Artemis by Andy Weir. So this is pretty crazy. Andy Weir has released 3 novels. His other 2 books, The Martian and Project Hail Mary, are rated like 4.4 and 4.5. Artemis has a 3.69. On Goodreads, that is a massive difference. People love his other 2 books and did not love Artemis. So I haven't tried it. I'm a little bit nervous to try it because Andy Weir set such a high bar. I'll have to read it eventually, but it's not super high on the TBR. Second Foundation, which is the third Foundation book by Isaac Asimov. I like this one slightly more than Foundation and Empire, but still not as much as Foundation. But I liked where the series went. I think it kind of wrapped up the trilogy, which was really just a set of short stories combined into one, but I liked how it ended. And then we have Life, the Universe, and Everything, the third Hitchhiker's book, which I haven't read. I've only read the first 2 so far. I probably will read this one, but I think I need to be in the right mood to pick it up. And then Starship Troopers, which I have not read. Although this one, I don't know. I'm trying to decide which Heinlein book to go with next. Let me know. Should I put it in the comments? Stranger in a Strange Land or Starship Troopers? Let me know your vote on that one. And oh, there we go. Here are the last 2. We were close to the end. We have The Forever War, which I mentioned earlier. One of the staples of military science fiction. Joe Haldeman was a Vietnam War veteran, used some of his experience to combine with a story to do with time travel, time dilation, aliens, and I think there's a lot of interesting things in there. Some good action, but some also sort of slower moments, character moments, things to do with this kind of futuristic society that I found to be very worthwhile reading. And then finally, I mentioned it, one of my all-time favorite books, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. My favorite of the 4 that I've read so far. This is a top 10 sci-fi book for me. And I think it's a good place to start with Clarke if you're not quite as into hard sci-fi. Some of his other books might focus on the science a little bit more. This, I think, it's still classic sci-fi that focuses on the ideas, but I found it to be very readable and it's split into 3 parts. Each part crazier than the next. The ending just absolutely blew me away. And once again, somewhere around here, I have the Folio Society edition of it. So there you go. Those are the top 50 most shelved science fiction books on Goodreads. I think my total score, if we add this up, I have read 35 of them, so we're doing fairly well. I own 3 more, so we're going to be ticking those off fairly soon. And of the ones that I haven't read, I think about 5 or so of them were YA, which, hey, if you like YA, that's great. I mean, there's a couple of YA books that I'm sure I would enjoy, and I'll give them a chance. But they might not be just quite as high on my TBR. So there you go. That was a fun little exercise. It lets you know maybe which of the classics you've read, which you haven't, which you might need to check out. For me, I found a couple. There's a couple on there which I'm thinking, yeah, this is probably time that I get around to these. But overall, I think we're doing pretty well. A lot of good books on this list. Let me know in the comments which are some of your favorites and which are some of these that are high on your TBR and you still need to read. So I hope this was fun. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope this was helpful. Hope you liked the video. If you did, smash, just crank on that subscribe button or just lightly click it with just enough pressure to change it from red to gray. Either way, it's all the same to me. Subscribe to the channel, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, a New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakalway, and the Top 50 column. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.